but I'm here.
Well, thank you very much for making it. And I think, so I'm trying to work out, yeah, exactly. So therefore, Peggy is the one who's on her way from the airport. Exactly, great. Hopefully Peggy will make it. But whatever happens, I was wondering how we were going to get through such a complex issue in the amount of time we've got with 4 very expert people. So we'll start gratefully with 3 to start with and take it from there. So I think you've all got the program in front of you. You know the issue we're going to be covering right now, which is looking at the Sustainable Development Goals in particular, with a focus on SDG 5, on gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. I thought there was a very interesting set of comments on one of the panels yesterday about thinking in a gender plus way, and obviously all of the SDGs are about their interconnections. I know a number of you will probably come up with this, and so we will not just be limited by that one SDG, but think about how it interconnects with the others as well. Immediately on my left, Gala Diaz-Langu, who is Social Protection Director at CPEC in Argentina. The exact acronym is there, Center for International Protection. In any case, I'll let you lay it out later on. But Argentina obviously playing an important role, having had the G20 presidency prior to Japan, and she was very much involved in the T20, the Think Tank 20 Sustainable Development Goal Task Force. Stephanie Ueda-Cruz, who is a women's empowerment, diversity, inclusion expert, but has worked as well quite a bit in the private sector. I think Coca-Cola, L'Oreal, a number of other places. So we're probably going to draw a little bit on your expertise in that area. Megan Falone, who just flew in, I think, from Rwanda. But is the founder and director of Barefoot College and colleges, I should say, a number of them established around India and appropriately attired for India. Not a stereotype, I think an outward set of...
stereotype.
Exactly, it's not a stereotype, but also setting up a lot of these colleges in sub-Saharan Africa as well now. And so we'll come into that issue in a minute. So I've got a chance to ask a few questions, get you to share some thoughts. We will bring all of you in as much as possible. We'll try and finish by 10:25 or so we at least get 5 minutes back on the infrastructure of this conference. Gala, you know, how to break apart the issue of gender equality and empowerment through one of the SDGs. There are so many ways to think about it, as the way we've kind of broken it out mentally. There are obviously the root causes of gender discrimination. Some of them are stereotypical, social. Many of them are down to policies, gender insensitive, one might say, fiscal policies, insufficient money being put into social infrastructure. There's the economic opportunities. We had technology yesterday. I think the doorway we were going to come to you through is some of that public provision of services that enable women to be able to pursue their economic dreams, their opportunities, their talents. And maybe you'd like to say a word or two, in particular on the kind of care infrastructure, your experience in Argentina and Latin America, the work you do there. Is this one of the areas that you're particularly focused on? And if it is, what's working, what isn't? Over to you.
Great. Well, yeah, indeed. Care policies are one of the key issues that we believe to be crucial for the achievement of all SDGs, as you were very well said. They're very well entangled, particularly for SDG 5, target 5.4 regarding unpaid work, but also target 5.5 regarding labor market participation, which are two sides of the same coin. Without redistributing care work within households, the participation outside of households in the labor market won't change. But also towards other SDGs, care policies are very much linked to poverty. Families who have to either choose to provide care or work are in a situation where there's a concrete trade-off that threatens their monthly income. So they have many more chances to be in poverty, but also towards education, providing care services of quality, especially in early childhood, provides the layout for a much more successful trajectory throughout the whole lifetime, particularly in education. There's a lot of evidence towards that. So this more holistic approach is needed in looking at these tensions that families face, and when I say families, I say mostly women, because we do know that women invest much more time in unpaid work, in the provision of care, in the provision of domestic work overall. And what we have been working on under the T20 and also in Argentina and also with the W20 as a delegate is on the 4 Rs that are behind care literature. This is to recognize care work. We need more time use services. We need to account for unpaid work within the GDP's estimates and national accounts overall. We need to reduce, that's the second R, care work. This is reduce the load that families face. So provide more public services, provide more public goods that would help families have more resources when they face this tension. Redistribute, that's the third one. And this has a lot to do with what we heard just now and what we heard yesterday in the last session. How can we change the social norms that say, well, you are a woman, you must take care of your children or your parents or people that need any caring of, and you are a man, you need to take care of your job. Okay. So how can we change that? And there are policies that can accelerate that concrete cultural change, and I can go down to that in a minute. And the fourth R, which is a bit hidden and is the newest one, is represent. We need to represent those who do the care work. We need unions for care workers that do paid work of caring within households, but we also need other types of representations for women who do unpaid work within the households. For instance, through fiscal policy, which Mina highlighted yesterday and you just highlighted right now, and it's one crucial way that today invisibilizes somehow care work.
And just to pick up a couple of those points, fiscal policy tends to follow the path of least resistance. And I suppose what's difficult for any government to do is to think ahead and say, by providing this social care policy, which is a cost in the near term, I need 2 or 3 years and I'll start to see the return in, therefore, more work undertaken principally by women, more tax return, more economic activity, more business, blah, blah, blah. So we all know the logic of why this should work, but I think one of the themes of this panel is there is no one-size-fits-all in any part of the world or even in any region. Have you got any examples, either from Argentina, from Latin America, or from other parts of the world, where being able to take the time to invest in some of those social care policies fiscally, governments can say, here's an example of something that's worked. We are succeeding. We've got maybe some developed economies that were successful, but those that are more in the emerging area, surely this is like kind of catch-22. People haven't got the money to invest, so you never find out whether women can provide the opportunity. Are there examples of it working?
Yes, there are. As you very well said, I mean, this has concrete economic returns, and we have proven that case. I mean, and this case is proven in Europe very much, in North America very much, but not that much in the rest of the world. So we have been working with the social accounting matrix in Argentina to estimate this business case behind closing gender gaps through care policies. So we estimated the returns of 3 concrete policies of provision of public care services, of extending the coverage of the extended school day, and of providing cash transfers for families with children so they could maybe pay for these services on their own. These 3 policies have concrete returns in 3 issues: employment, tax returns, and ultimately on GDP growth. So these 3 policies could create together over 2 million positions of employment in Argentina. This is only in Argentina. In the next administration, which will start in December, throughout 2023.
So you're trying to get these messages into them now?
Yeah, this should be a priority for the next government. It is a priority, and it should be a priority. It isn't a priority.
One last question, because we're just keeping on time, and I want to get Megan and Stephanie in as well. To what extent do you think the governments are actually taking this on board? And are international financial institutions, for example, using this as a measurement of the types of deficit spending, for example, that a pretty indebted country like Argentina would be allowed to undertake? Yeah. Is there an understanding, and are you being given the time to make this work?
Well, it is a challenge. It is not a priority right now. It could be a priority, and it is, actually the IMF is pushing for it. Right, okay. I think because of Lagarde's influence in that, but the issue is that we are facing the end of the demographic bonus, so our society is aging, and this problem will only get bigger. So if we don't face it right now, we don't start investing in these policies right now, the problem we will have 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years from now will be almost impossible. We'll have a huge pensions regime to support without the structure to support it, and we will have an impoverished population that won't be able to face that. So it is crucially an investment.
That's a very important point. I think, as you said, there's so few parts of the world where demography is still growing, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, but not, obviously, in Latin America. Which, let me move on. Very interesting points. We'll come back to them later. Megan, let me turn to you now. As I said, founder and director of Barefoot College International, and I mentioned the parts of the world where you're working, very much a sort of community-based, inclusive model. And I wanted to come at you on the issue of gender empowerment and this SDG 5 in particular, and just try to get a little bit of the philosophy, I suppose, of Barefoot College here for everyone to understand more effectively. Because I think you have talked a little bit about organizations having to think in more of a sort of bottom-up way, that we can't rely as much on governments. It's about empowering groups to act almost as social movements. And I think your colleges are trying to give that sense of empowerment to the women that you work with. And the very term Barefoot College is a statement almost in itself. What are you bringing that you think is different, that's missing? Yeah, let's say in parts of India in particular. We can come to Africa later on, but let's pick the region you obviously know best at the moment.
You know, I think we're in a very serious place. And as a social entrepreneur who came from the private sector, I'm quite frustrated at how slow things move. And so I'm a doer and a practitioner, and at Barefoot, my whole team really is focused that way. And I think what we're seeing is, if you think about the three pillars, we have government, private sector, and community. We have largely disempowered community by encumbering it through policy that doesn't work, through multilateral organizations which continue to do studies. And what we haven't done is really cede power to the community. And without community empowered, in every sense of that word community, the power of the state and the forces of the market can run roughshod. And that's where we are. And as it relates specifically to the SDGs, and I would say the SDGs around women and girls, that becomes even amplified more by the fact that in so many ways, we have left our poorest sisters behind, both with technology, both with education, both with healthcare, and really a holistic understanding of what they need to play the role they need to play in their community, in their home, and in their governments. So I think that's what we're looking at. And I don't have a lot of time to wait for us to do another 10-year policy study. So what I think,
a little skeptical in a way
I'm a little,
whether the governments will be able to get there in time.
I'm quite sure the governments can get there, but in order to get there, and the successes we've had in working with governments have all been in co-designing programs with government. That really hands-on approach where a government is willing to engage with us to truly understand what works and how do we align our policy and our financial procedures in order to enable that. And that takes a very enlightened view. And I think right now we're looking at an overall system in the Global South that has no incentives to do that and no penalties when they don't. And that's what's got to happen. We have to start holding governments accountable to take positive action and get results on the ground. So I think that's really, our work in particular is a beautiful kind of work. We train illiterate and semi-literate women to be solar engineers. from all over the world. We bring them to India or to 5 other barefoot colleges, and we train them without written language and without a common spoken language to build a 196-piece circuit board. And they fabricate their own line of solar home lighting products, which is the only one in the world designed, built, manufactured, repaired, and maintained only by women. That program, one woman at a time, has now brought light to more than 1.2 million people. So scale can happen when we focus on really capacity building, giving away power to individuals, and then letting them replicate that in the way they think is important. Now that program is done in conjunction with the government of India and with 36 host governments around the world. So it has actually changed energy policy in 11 countries to allow for funds to flow from cabinet notes to renewable energy decentralized projects with women at the heart of that.
So, and in India, I mean, a notoriously decentralized country, yeah, with federal system and then all sorts of levels. Because very interesting what you said, you are part of a social movement, but you have to work in co-designing and in partnership with government. So energy policy could not be a more centralized kind of notion. Yeah. And yet you've taken that one as the area where you really want to make a difference. This is Gender Plus, as an example. So could you just give us an example of how you work, for example, with a local government or with a federal government? They design a particular, I suppose they want to reduce their dependency on traditional fossil fuels, or maybe they can't do the distribution. Are you working in collaboration with them? Are they providing tax incentives? Are they helping with the training? How much are you left to your own devices? And how much are you able to say, look, I've got a brilliant answer here, we're mobilizing people, let's do it together?
So in India, what we have found that works is by engaging the private sector. By having private sector and private philanthropy come in to help us set models and pilots in place, but by bringing the government along with us in a very respectful dialogue from the beginning, not asking them for anything necessarily, except to follow what we're doing, to be aware and to understand. As they begin to see that reality on the ground happen, and of course the women are quite extraordinary, and when you hear them, you know it's the right thing. They then start to look for ways in which they can align government programs and other things to help us. It is not an easy task. Working with government takes a tremendous amount of patience and a tremendous amount of perseverance, but it does and can actually work when you have the right individuals. One thing I will note is that where we work anywhere in the world with a woman permanent secretary, minister, we have 50% less roadblock. Yeah. And those women, and there are some extraordinary bureaucrats out there in the developing world who are unsung heroes, who manage, just by their sheer force of determination, to push the programs that they know work through a very tough system. So I think supporting them also becomes a collective issue.
India is a notoriously patriarchal society in that sense. We talked about stereotypes a second ago. This is a women-only initiative, as I understand it. So is that, as you look at SDG 5, in a way we're taking 3 very individual examples here, but is that a problem? Is this something you'll need to get beyond in your business model, that it becomes gender inclusive on the other side with men as well? Or is this actually seen as a plus and a benefit because you're making women more economically contributory within communities and villages? How does that sit?
I think the beauty of this model is that we designed it such that the power, no pun intended, rests with the woman, but the benefit rests with the community. Right. And so that immediately brings men into the process, both in the selection of the women when we very first start, but also as the beneficiaries. What the number one increase in a community will be livelihood for men and women because they can work in the evenings when they have light. And so there's an almost immediate, and it's really funny because many of the men object when we first propose to take a woman from their community. There's quite a bit of objection, you can imagine. And the community actually plays a strong role in moving that mentality of that individual to a more conducive one to say yes, because they understand the benefit to everybody. But additionally, she comes back, and then of course, she is in control of the one infrastructure thing that communities in the developing world want more than anything. So she's a hero. And that shifts her role not only with the men in her life, but also as a role model for other girls and women to be able to say, well, gosh, if my 50-year-old grandmother can be a solar engineer, then I'm 18, what can I do? Yeah. So this whole link to STEM and to more technical pathways for women and girls, I think is hugely important at every level of our society.
Look, a very positive set of examples, and that way that it spills over. We've had the stereotype element here, empowerment. Look, a very positive story. Let me come to Stephanie Huerta-Cruz now. Stephanie is Head of Gender and Diversity Inclusion at IDB Invest, but as I mentioned earlier, she brings to that some very significant and important. Hey, Stephanie. Peggy, welcome to this as well. Glad you made it.
Thank you.
Transport is semi-working. It's perfect because we haven't got to the end of the flow yet. So have a glass of water, relax for a second, and we'll come to you in a second. I'm just telling Stephanie first. But brings a lot of private sector experience as well to this panel. And we just heard about from Megan the importance of the role of working with the private sector and seeing them as partners in this process. I'm wondering on partnerships and how companies think about how they engage with stakeholders. There is also, I imagine, an element of need for long-term thinking. Yes, we were talking about governments having to think beyond the near term to what the return might be beyond their electoral cycle. Companies as well might have business models that work today, but when we're thinking about gender inclusiveness, you have to think, I presume, sometimes beyond the near-term shareholder bottom line of the quarter or maybe even the half year or the full year. What's your experience of the way that companies are thinking differently about including women within their kind of business plans? They're thinking about diversity and partnerships with groups that make these differences. What's your experience? What's happening? Are we in a good stage or are we in a bad stage of that process?
Well, thanks for the question, and thank you for the invitation. I think it all depends on where you're sitting. So I just want to start by saying that, you know, if you think about the SDGs, a little bit like Bernice mentioned yesterday, none of them works independently. All of them will act together. SDG 5, which is the one that focuses on women and girls, is one of the SDGs that companies can embrace easier, as well as, you know, climate or clean energy actually is the ones that private sector go naturally towards too. But partnerships are key, and I think it's represented even in the panel. The private sector doesn't hold the silver bullet, nor governments, nor third sector. It's really, if we want to change the world and business as it is asking and working today, we need to act collaboratively. It is a challenge, as you were saying, to work with actors that are different than you, because timings are not the same, the way of doing things are not the same, the return on investment that you might expect are not the same. So I think one of the challenges is like, how do we put together a strategy that will work for each one of us? And from a private sector perspective, I want to share, I would say, 3 things on why the private sector cares or should care more, particularly on gender equality. The first one will be around finance, because, you know, as a company, you need finance, whether you're a large, you know, FTSE 350, CAC 40, etc., or an SME, you need finance to operate. The second one is you need talent. You know, if you want to be a key player and win more consumers, you need the right people in place. And the third one that is becoming the most important one, I think, it's your license to operate. A lot more, you know, companies, consumers are saying, so what are you doing? What's happening in your value chain? I want to know where I'm buying from. Niham mentioned it yesterday, you know, what's the traceability? I want to be sure. So let me start then by finance and how also partnerships are playing there and how gender is starting to come. If you want your company to succeed, you need to assess the risks, but as well the opportunities in the sector that you're operating, I would say in your ecosystem. Finance has been really smashed in the last year by everything that has happened, and we know about that, and I won't go into that piece, but what we have seen is that more and more financial institutions are actually taking a gender perspective, not only in how many women do they have in their teams, but rather how are the financial products that they are using and putting together are responding to women's needs. So let me give you an example. Yesterday, Wendy mentioned, how women and men are not consuming finance in the same way. Banks and financial institutions are being more aware of that, is a women business owner needing finance and getting finance from a normal institution? Yes, no, what can I do differently? Latin America, if I focus on Latin America for a second, the gap for women owners to get finance is $86 billion. So imagine if those women would get that finance and being able to, get back to their communities and actually be able to do something. So right now, the finance world is actually starting to say, hey, there must be a business opportunity that we're lacking because women are our consumers. A woman is way more loyal to her bank, pays better. So, and I like that because if you want things to succeed, you also need to have something in it for you as a business. So they're seeing the opportunity of the women market and actually responding to that by creating products. We have seen a lot of green bonds in the past. Now we're talking about gender bonds and how that will actually go to women, to support projects as the one Megan was mentioning. So that's something that I think it's quite interesting. And again, no matter your size as a business, you need finance. The second point I want to go about is talent. In the panel before, you were talking about diversity and the importance of having diverse teams. Well, when you have more women in your leadership teams, the latest research by McKinsey, basically your returns on profitability will go up of like 29%. And if you add to that racial diversity, it goes up to 34%. And it's not like by magic. It's because suddenly you have different experiences of people, different ways of seeing a problem, and therefore bringing solutions to the table. So when you see that women are way more educated now, at least in Latin America, and I guess that's also the case in the world, they're graduating more from college, as a business, you want to bring that talent. Now, internally as well, as Gala was mentioning, as a company, you need to address that what's happening within your company, it's not completely disconnected that what's happening in the world. So a lot of, maternity and paternity policies, allowing the men to have more than 1 day paternity leave or, just 1 week. Because if you want to start changing the role of women within the workforce and within the corporate world, you also need to start changing the role of men, and that goes by encouraging by the role models, because you can tell me I have 80,000 policies, but if I see that no leader is actually taking advantage of that, that's the real culture happening within a company. So now we're also encouraging a lot more of that happening. In Latin America, for example, if all the women participated in the workforce as men, our GDP as a region will go up by 34%. I think we need that development. We need that communities thriving, more jobs, basically, more circular, like finance going into the economy. So that's talent. And I want to expand on like the mentorships or like, all of the things that pretty much every company now has, but rather really how do we help them put that into real practice and seeing that income coming back, as Gala was mentioning, on care, caring, and not only on kids, but also the aging population. Latin America is aging 20 times faster than the rest of the world. So the transition that happened in Europe will have it 20 times faster. So that's something that we need to think about, And when you see that in Mexico, women spend 47 hours in, house chores that it's unpaid, and men 20, that is something, And the last piece I want to mention is the license to operate. North America or Europe, the consciousness of, is this product green? Is this product socially responsible? Started a couple of years ago. But in the global south, what is happening is that we're leapfrogging. So just like it happened with the cell phone, that here you had all the transition and we suddenly had like landline and suddenly you're like on WhatsApp. That's happening as well with the education of the consumer. The world is connected now, and consumers are saying, so where is this coming from? How is that women are being treated in that value chain? And as we saw in the panel yesterday, the Me Too movement, even though it really started in the US and expanded to the rest of the world, Latin America had one. Argentina had a very strong one. So there's this social conscious of, what are you doing internally? do I want to join your company? Is it something that I need to look at? And of course, the consumer. And I think that as women, and men as well, but particularly women, it's, your wallet is a weapon. So where are you buying from, and actually make that change, because if business, I have seen something changes, is when you're seeing your bottom line affected, that's when suddenly everything changes around. So if you start buying from companies that, are actually more respectful to women, that have responsible practices, that's going to make a difference.
So the transparency element becomes all the more important as well in that space. You've got to be able to know which companies are operating well, which are not. And I suppose social media and the information, the democratization of information is a big element in that. I'm keeping an eye on time. Now, obviously, we'll have a chance to come back to all of you with other points, and I will come, I think, quicker rather than later, out to all of our participants here in a minute to ask some questions. But as Peggy has made it here, Peggy, thrilled that you could join us. I think you've come in from Geneva, and Director Thematic Engagement in the Special Procedures and Right to Development Division of the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva. A lot of work in particular, I think, in the Balkans, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, etc. And you've done work, I know, at Human Rights Watch as well prior to this as well. You didn't get, obviously, all of the previous parts of the conversation, but one of the issues that was heavily discussed at the beginning was the way that stereotyping has limited the capacity for us to meet some of the broadly now defined SDG goals, SDG 5, and I think 8 and 10 as well, being connected to this as well. Where do you want to come in? Because I feel you're a little bit blindsided by what other people have said, and you won't know where they've been. But I think the issue you were going to want to cover in particular was the way gender stereotyping, yes, is limiting the capacity for women to live up to their economic potential, and in particular how that's affecting the changing world of work. I'll let you jump in on whatever points you wanted to make at this point, so we didn't have a chance to coordinate too much beforehand.
No, thanks, and apologies to everybody for being late. It was the quickest run ever from Gatwick without the express, I think. But just even the little bit I've heard, I'm sorry I've missed some of the conversation. The perspective we have, I wanted to come in a bit looking at the overall Sustainable Development Goals and the opportunity we see to correct some of these issues and to move forward on pervasive issues like gender stereotyping. We face this in human rights generally. Human rights is often the afterthought, the thing that comes in at the end when policies are being made. And if it's not too inconvenient, you somehow mix it into the mix and try to make sure you're checking that box. The Sustainable Development Goals give us an opportunity to move beyond that. And there's one goal that's sort of identified by many as the human rights goal, which is goal 16, which looks at just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. But the reality is, the way our office looks at it, is this is our wonderful opportunity to show how human rights is a key component of sustainability throughout all of the goals, through all 17. And in thinking about it, the gender equality issue, I think that's the case, the most pervasive and persuasive case within that this is really the moment for the gender equality lens to move beyond goal 5, which is, of course, very important in the focus, but to see how we can bring the rights of women and the need for gender empowerment and engagement throughout the full range of activities, everything from the right to water to partnerships and the full scope of everything that's being done within the Sustainable Development Goals. And within that equation, some of the things that we focus on as opportunities here really relate to the use of data, and really thinking about how one of the stories of women is the extent to which women are left out in terms of development data in a variety of ways. And this is an enormous opportunity to correct that imbalance and to really make sure that we're capturing the way that I've heard you've had the conversation about women's work in care and at home, and how that can be better captured in the disaggregated approach that's taken within the SDGs. And the more that's done, the more I think we will see the extent to which there will be no sustainable development across all of the spectrum without gender equality and without engaging women more directly. And one of the things that we look at as well is the extent to which even the power relations have to be reflected within the types of data that we're collecting. So it's not enough to say that there's access to sexual and reproductive health and rights if in fact the decisions are being made in a home where even if there's access, men are going to be the ones that decide whether or not the woman is able to have that access. So we need to also, look a little bit deeper in terms of some of the data that we're collecting. The other piece I wanted to make sure to flag, and I know it's going to be talked about this afternoon as well, is the extent to which the digital revolution is affecting the way that we implement the SDGs and the way that women are affected by it. And of course, there's a very negative story there in many senses, in that there's a massive digital divide, and our office has documented this in a report we did last year that really looks at the extent to which women, because of their, are being left behind even further because they're not as likely to be connected to the internet and to be engaged in digital professions. And of course, what we see is both a product of that and a product of existing gender inequality, where those two things come together, and it's really a double whammy, where you have situations like AI systems that are trained on existing employees and then only select for men because that's all they've ever seen are a database of men. So finding a way to work around those issues and to avoid some of the ways that women will be hit harder within the digital side is one of the things the office is really focusing on. And we do think, of course, as has been said, that there's a critical role that companies can play in that regard as well, in terms of finding, really looking at how engaging women earlier in design processes, bringing them along throughout the equation, will allow for the work that's being done to be from design from the start to take into account women in a way that currently isn't happening. One of the startling statistics that maybe has already been said, but I'll repeat it in case, is a study that was done recently by Equals that tells us that as much as we'd like to say that in societies where we have greater gender equality, we would like to think that women are moving forward in the ICT field in a higher percentage, but in fact it shows an inverse relation, where in fact very gender equal societies are not making progress in terms of women's integration into ICT. And for me, that's one of the things that really needs some of our investment and engagement.
Thank you, Peggy. And I wanted you, as you've done, point to a particular area where we need all of us to put more focus on, and that particular one is there. Very interesting, your point about data and needing to have it, and obviously governments and companies are both have much more access to it now. The idea of citizens and women being empowered to demand the change. I still look around the world, the amount of male-dominated government, where it is dominated, you just feel that the ability to understand these issues may be that much more limited. So women in government obviously is a critical issue all around the world at the moment. I do want to bring us in because we've got about only 10 minutes or 15 minutes max left for this panel. I want to make sure we had an opportunity to come in. You may have some points you want to raise off each other's presentations, so keep that in mind as well. But who wants to come in now? And I can take 2 or 3 points as hands go up. I've got 1, 2, 3, and I'll maybe take you first. Yeah, so 2, 1 in the back row and 1 in, yeah, exactly. If you do those 2 there. Introduce yourself as well, please.
Sure. Thank you very much for that really interesting discussion. I'm Claire Falconer. I'm from the Freedom Fund. I was really interested in Stephanie's comments about consumers driving change. And I was wondering about the what evidence there was about the impact of mandatory transparency and reporting. I was quite heavily involved in the Modern Slavery Act development and implementation and the mandatory reporting on supply chains contained within that act. And one of the kind of key criticisms of that act was that it would only really drive the change of the kind of those companies who wanted to change, or the sort of top level performance, and that it wouldn't bring along the other companies, especially companies that weren't so consumer facing, so maybe oil companies or things like resource industry and so on. And so I'm just wondering in the sort of gender reporting, and we have the gender pay gap reporting here in the UK, what evidence there is of that impact across the whole of the market.
That's great. And I think the more we can have the questions on what's changed, what have you seen has changed, and what needs to be done next, as opposed to what should have been changed in the past, if you see what I'm saying. What's changing now, and what are the nearest challenges we have? And there's one good example. Please at the front first, and we'll go to the back. Yep.
Thanks very much. Ken Bluestone from Age International. I was really pleased, first of all, just thank you so much for your extraordinary work that you're all doing, to hear the link being made to population aging. What I wanted to just do is to bring it back to the research that we've done with ODI, which actually demonstrates the significance of population aging is about also understanding what is the contributions that older women are making. And they continue to provide domestic unpaid care, paid care and support, as well as for their families, as well as the community, up to 4.3 hours a day, if not more. And that gender inequality between women and men continues into later life. Of 2.5 times more work are done by women. And the data is not there because, you know, the traditional tools that we use for capturing data, demographic household surveys, typically stop at the age of 49. So we're just not getting the information we need. So what suggestions do you have about how can we make those economic contributions, the role that older women are making, more visible?
Very important point. Ironic if we had, as you said, technology potentially knocking women back a little bit in terms of their inclusion in work, aging potentially driving more women back into the caring role, we could have some real headwinds on the progress that's been made in recent years. There's a question right at the back. Yeah, that hand up. The microphone's behind you. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for those really interesting presentations. I was just wondering, I'm Larissa Darenberg. I was just wondering, when Megan was talking about creating incentive for governments to engage in co-designing policies, how do you create incentive for those governments to engage in positive action, and why has it not yet been implemented if it has been so positive in some research?
Yeah. Back to that perennial problem of everyone knows what they should do, but doing it is incredibly difficult for all the reasons we know. But let's take those questions. You've got population aging, whether consumers are driving change. Maybe Stephanie, start with you on that one. And if people want to pick up on any of the others, please do. But why don't you kick off on that one?
Well, thank you so much for the question, Claire. I think it's key because you measure what you treasure. And as you were saying, we're lacking a lot of data. So we're doing with the best we can with what we have. I think one of the challenges with the SDGs and how we're measuring it is that it is a lot. You know, you have 17 SDGs and 169 sub-targets that you kind of like need to either respond to, or you choose what SDG is more like linked to your company or your business model. So I think that's also something that collectively we need to think about. You know, change won't be easy, but we need to make it easier, or at least, you know, by chunks. So that's something that I guess a lot more alignment is needed. To your point of how are we measuring this, it's still imperfect, you know, and I really welcome the initiatives like the Modern Slavery Act or, you know, Bloomberg Gender Equality Index. And that's important, you know. Now companies are reporting back on GRI. PwC launched a study early this year, and the largest companies are now 72% of them reporting on SDGs, on their sustainability strategy. That's good, you know, because the SDGs were launched, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago. So it's massive, you know, it's a massive step. And that also came because of the consciousness of people, you know, media, how everyone is now more aware that, yes, climate change is actually real, you know, and what do we need to do about it? And that is actually making markets move. And when I mean markets, it's not only the financial markets, but how the economy works. Now more and more, when you're investing in companies, you're looking at what are you doing in those aspects. And not, I mean, of course, because you're a good citizen, but mostly because that is a risk. I want to invest in a company that will survive all of the changes that are coming, whether it's digital, whether it is, you know, reputational risk, and all of this is linked. So tracking all of that, it's necessary now. I think we're moving from a nice to have to actually a must have. And each company is now taking what that must have is looking for them. And very quickly on on the point about the older population and how we're taking that into account, I actually want to point out two examples from the UK that now I think the world is looking at, and particularly in Latin America. The first one is the gender pay gap that you need to report. I was still living in the UK when that legislation passed. It's not perfect, certainly, the way you have to calculate, but that's, you have to put your results out there to the consumer, but also you need to explain internally. And that's something that a position that, believe me, suddenly every executive was like, what is happening? What's our gender pay gap? And what do we need to do? So yes, it works because it forces you to change. And in the older population, I loved something that I believe it's EY, they launched that in the UK, that it's people returning to work. And that's something that it's about valuing and recognizing the skills that you may get throughout life. And also if by any reason you exit the workforce and you want to come back. So that's something we're following very closely. And I think companies now need to understand that, it's not only the young people and the graduates that will have everything, necessary to drive change, but we need that change in representation and understanding that we're going to live 100 years life soon. And how we're structuring our governments, our policies, the work life needs to change.
Gali, you want to come in next? Yeah, Peggy,
I will just build on what Stephanie was just saying. I completely agree, and I think that this gaps that we're seeing in general population widen in older ages. And I completely agree, we don't have the data to account for that. We have very small data that indicate towards it, but we need to make concrete the saying that we can only be what we see. And this is true for role models, but this is true also for statistical systems. So we need to have more disaggregated data, better data to make this point. Women in older age also face more probabilities to be under poverty, because when they haven't worked throughout their lifetime in formal employment, they don't have the contributions to receive a pension later on. So this is a huge problem, and in Latin America we have seen it, and the gap in pension coverage is huge for men and women. And this is just saying that women did unpaid work throughout their lifetime. So we did have some examples with some countries in statute universal pension regimes where they accounted for these years of unpaid work, or Scandinavian countries that do provide extra contributions for each child that each woman had, or there are different schemes, but actually we need a more collaborative approach between the business sector, between the unions, and between the states to face this problem. And this problem needs to be faced with a huge focus on inequality, because it's very different how families from different strata face this tension of taking care of their own and working. And this inequality perspective sweeps throughout the whole lifetime. And if we only end up focusing on formal employment, or if we solely focus on corporate-led solutions, this will only widen the gap, the inequality gap. So we need to have also a huge consideration of how do families in the informal market do these arrangements, and what can we do, and especially in terms of public policies, what can we do to close these gaps? Because this is what we're talking about here. How can we shape the future we want? And we certainly want a more equal future, both in terms of gender, but also in terms of socio-economic disaggregation. And this is especially important to achieving the SDGs, because we actually need to leave no one behind.
It's ironic that we've talked a lot about maternity leave, but of course we don't talk about leave to be able to take care of older people. There's no sense of that whole of life approach to work.
We provide paternal and maternal leave throughout the whole lifetime for informal workers.
As well, yeah, exactly. Never mind. So, It's very complicated. Sense. Did you want to come? Peggy, I know wants to come in, but Megan, do you want to come in first on any of these points?
Sure, yeah. I would like to pick up on a couple of things. I think we need to remind ourselves and remember that the continent of Africa and all of India as a subcontinent are in the exact opposite end of the aging conversation. And so what we have is a sort of one world problem over here on aging populations, but we have an equally and statistically a larger problem on the other end, which is youth. The answer to this from our point of view is around lifelong learning and changing the way access to knowledge and skills becomes available to those in marginalized, poor communities, in places where they can't read and write. Why is it that you have to read and write to learn how to be a solar engineer? For example, it's not necessary. This is about our own innovative abilities to leverage technology and to be able to open source better the knowledge that people need to learn as they go through their life in a changing world. And right now we have a lot of barriers there. The data needs to be collected directly from individuals. I'll give you just one tiny example of how the data goes wrong. I had 2 Ernst & Young consultants who came to me from Delhi, 24, 25 years old, and they were sent to collect data in 5 villages in Uttarakhand, which is about a 5-hour train ride and a 2-hour walk to go to that set of communities. They started crying on the train. And they got to the village and, in fact, had a complete meltdown that they felt endangered, and that they were not going to be safe, and so they couldn't possibly go to those households. So right now, our data collection is far too determined on individuals doing surveys in old-fashioned, completely analog ways, which is no longer accurate. We need to create technology solutions which empower citizens, individuals, to feed their own data directly to us, because that's the way we will clarify the data issue. What incentives for government? Huge ones. Preferential financing. Access to things like the International Solar Alliance, which was founded by Prime Minister Modi and President Macron of France, which is a collective that essentially offers preferential access to renewable energy infrastructure projects, financing, and technology knowledge. So I think there are a lot of things that can be done to entice government, but along with the incentives needs to be a stick when they don't move in that direction. There must be an accountability for governments to move in a much more decisive direction towards engaging and meeting targets around women. And I do think that quotas or programs that have quotas attached to them are effective in catalyzing an initial adoption. After that, my impression is wherever we've gotten it through the door, it then goes. But it's that critical moment of how do you make it more embarrassing? It's the Human Rights Watch approach. How do you make it more embarrassing for somebody not to be complying, for a country not to be anteing in? Having just been in Rwanda, to look at a country where 63% of the parliament is women is just extraordinary. And when you meet the information technology minister, and she's an MIT grad from Rwanda, and you listen to her enlightened view on how she's running that ministry, you completely understand the value of a gender-balanced approach by governments and why we need to push them in this direction.
Perfect. A good call out as well. I'm just aware it's 10:25, so what I'm going to do is, Peggy, yours will be the last comment on this. We're not going to be. We've got panels throughout the whole day. You'll have plenty of opportunity to come back and raise questions across them. And just as a reminder, we're all working up towards the breakout sessions this afternoon, which are about coming up with the answers that will be reported back. So I hope you're sort of picking up ideas that you want to really make sure you could explore as part of the answers this afternoon. But Peggy, I'm going to give you the last word in that sense, I think, therefore, on this panel, so we stay a little bit with time. Pick up on any of the questions or what you heard some of the other speakers come up with here as well.
Thanks. No, I wanted to pick up on the comment about how we go beyond sort of the top tier companies and move forward, because I think it goes back to your question of how do we shift culture and stereotyping, not just the legal framework and the structural side of inequality. It's one of the issues we've thought a lot about and actually been pretty self-critical about how the human rights movement has engaged in terms of not bringing people along and finding ways in which what we talk about is about the other rather than about ourselves, and really bringing rights home to people in a way that make them something that they recognize that they have something to gain in working and supporting rights. But I think that's true of companies as well, that we've made it more difficult than it needs to be. And I think your comment about the breadth of the SDG framework and how it's not necessarily the easiest thing for a company to jump in and figure out what exactly it's supposed to be doing is a good point. There's a lot of work that's being done on that right now to really help corporations that are trying to find a way to navigate this space and figure out, what are the top tier issues? What are the things that they need to take up, and can they be most effective in? Sometimes it is a question of a company feeling like they either have to go full out name and shame or do nothing. And of course, there's a real range of ways in which companies can take more responsible action with regards to gender equality and human rights. And overall, we're working on a project that looks at the role of human rights activists and human rights defenders on the ground and how companies can better support them, recognizing, of course, that women's human rights defenders are some of the most endangered. And I just wanted to close with the final comment, and going back to a comment that it sounds like has been made throughout, which is that we both need companies to engage in this, but we also need to see that obviously women's equality is not going to be achieved by women. It's got to be achieved by the population as a whole, and that does mean finding a way to bring forward, as I understand you've been talking about, paternity leave and the role of men on the care side, and the role of men as spokespeople and champions for some of what needs to be done, and obviously looking beyond women and men to a non-binary look and LGBTI community, and seeing this as something that we can bring together everybody around a way that we can recognize that real achievement, sustainable development, is going to be dependent on everyone having a voice and participating effectively.
Well, thank you very much for that. Look, this is inevitably an opening panel when you talk about SDG 5 of gender equality and opportunities for women and girls. It's like the whole conference rolled almost into one thing. And Steph, you wanted a very quick...
Just two numbers that I want you all to go and walk out with that. It's if companies work around SDGs, it's 12 trillion added to the economy, 12 trillion, and 380 million jobs worldwide. So it's a business imperative.
So one of the big takeaways from here is that having measurements, but also having targets, being able to prove them a little bit, to have them statistically there, something for governments to aspire towards is essential. But the bottom-up approach, we can't wait for the governments, we can't rely on them. How do we get the private sector and civil society to work together? We're going to have the next panel come straight up. Borja Santos is going to be chairing the next one. So I want to say, could you please give a very strong hand and stay in your seats? Thank you very much.